Sliding in again. These hands are mine this time. A magnetic box, the splinter. What kind of splinter? It's a knife. We're back with another knife. Warrior Poet Society. We merged with Alex Steele, Evan Temple, Will Stelter, John Lovell. Crafted the finest blade this side of the Mississippi. It's bad little blade. It'll get into places you need it to. Why? Because we got tricks, baby. Quick Draw McGraw. We're headed into the holidays. These bad boys are gonna go quick. You better grab some. Oh, wait, what am I talking about? I better snag my own. See you there. WarriorPoetSociety.com.
All right, hey folks, welcome back. I am John Lovell. Despite not having a beard, some of you guys are still freaking out about that. You're not going to get used to it. Yes, I am John Lovell, a beardless, much younger version of myself. And today what I want to talk about is the history of revolution. What can we learn from past revolutions? How can we be informed of the present given past crisis? And I want to be able to talk to a real historian about that. And this historian is Stephen Mansfield. He's the best-selling author, New York Times best-selling author many times over, all kinds of great books. And he's become a friend of mine as well in more recent history. So Men on Fire is his more recent book. He's got Mansfield's Book of Manly Men, really cool cover. I bought this Healing Your Church Hurt, thought that was good. God and Guinness. I started recently reading this, 10 Tortured Words, incredibly good book. All kinds of other books, bios of Churchill and Lincoln, incredible wealth of knowledge. And we have him here today. Stephen Mansfield, thanks for coming on.
Great to be with you, John. Thanks for having me.
Yep. So folks who haven't met you before in our audience, I wanted to let them know I just met Stephen recently in a trip we took. A bunch of other authors and speakers all congregated abroad, and we were in this meeting, and I saw the docket, all these impressive names, and I saw yours. And what did I tell you I did?
You just fell down and worshiped is what you told me. You just said, he's the best thing on the planet. I'm so privileged to be in his presence. I mean, that's how I remember it.
Is that so? Well, he's not terribly far off because I looked at the docket. I saw Stephen Mansfield. I'm a nerd at heart. And so I'm like, I've got to sit by this guy. And so I positioned myself right beside you. I didn't give you a choice. I'm like, I'm going to be buddies with you. And since I think I'm the better fighter of the two of us, you didn't balk. You just you accepted my friendship, which I appreciate.
I recognized a credible threat, and I was thrilled to be your friend.
Fantastic. Hey, let's talk about revolution. Okay, so I was reading in 10 Tortured Words yesterday, and I was astounded by the differences in the French Revolution and the American Revolution. Just really shocking stuff for me because I didn't learn this in school even close. And so that kind of got me thinking on just how different revolutions happen. And I know how I think about revolutions. I think about like a revolution, it's messy. It oftentimes doesn't accomplish the results that it was after, meaning I look at them as general failures. I wonder whether any of the people in those revolutions, if they had the benefit of hindsight, would have still engaged in them. And I wonder what type of tipping point things, what kind of things happened right before a revolution that signify a revolution is about to happen. Tread lightly, be aware. So I want to know how a historian looks and feels when confronted with the subject of revolution.
Yeah, it's a pretty diverse topic. And I'll tell you, there have been lots and lots of revolutions throughout history. Most of them have been failures. Most of them have been failures. And there are basically two types of revolution, one that's designed to overthrow a social order and one that's designed to restore one. And that's basically your difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The French Revolution was a radical revolution designed to overthrow tradition, overthrow a social order, gave itself to radicalism, gave itself to excess, gave itself to bloodshed. You may remember that the cry, we often get it in our textbooks as liberty and fraternity, but the actual cry was liberty, fraternity, or death. So there was a threat behind that. There was much bloodshed. But the American Revolution, arguably the most successful revolution in world history, was really what some historians call a conservative counter-revolution. It was a desire to restore an order, restore covenantal arrangements, restore subjection to authority and establish authority. So whereas in the French Revolution, you end up with bloodletting and prostitutes laying on the high altar at Notre Dame and people having intercourse in the aisles and all that kind of thing, and extreme radicalism. In the American Revolution, you're cutting off connection to Britain because the British Parliament has gone radical, and you're trying to restore faith, family, decentralized government. In other words, a conservative social order. And that really defines the difference throughout history, in addition to a few other factors I'm sure we'll talk about.
Right. I was so struck in 10 Tortured Words, this book, where you had the juxtaposition of the French Revolution here, which looked like an all-out crazy orgy, pagan, whatever, worship service at Notre Dame versus kind of the contrasting founding fathers, old men arguing about ideas and coming together to sign a declaration and make a noble, just shockingly different.
The classic symbol of that would be this. During the French Revolution, as you've already seen and read and we talked about, you've got a prostitute butt naked on the high altar at Notre Dame. You've got people having intercourse in the aisles. You've got orgies happening throughout the city. You've got religion being trashed. You've got bloodletting and radicalism and murder. However, many of the men who led the American Revolution were clergymen, people who were turning to God. There was an organization called the Black Regiment. This was not a regiment of black skinned people. It was a regiment of clergy who at that time in history would have worn black robes. And so many of the commanders of units, many of those they weren't just serving as chaplains in the military, they were actually serving as warriors. But on Sundays, they would wear their black robes. They were called the Black Regiment. The founding fathers often stopped to pray. And it was the British, their opponents, who burned down churches or turned churches into houses of prostitution, burned copies of the Bible, burned copies of hymnals, arrested clergymen, and so on. So you see that the real foundation, a real issue in both of these is the question of religion and God and his authority and whether they're turning to God or away from God. The American Revolution was a turning towards God, his order, and traditional ways. The French Revolution was a radical rebellion against all of those things. And of course, it failed and failed horribly.
And it didn't really have anything to turn to, right? Because it's kind of like they kept, it's more revolutions right after the other. It's kind of like they hated what was there, but they didn't have the noble ideal to go to like we did. They were revolting against the old way, but they didn't have this new way. They just were like, we want freedom and licentiousness, and we just want to go nuts like libertines. But I don't know that without that noble ideal, your revolution is going to ever land in greener pastures, right?
Well, it's a great point. And I have to say that one of the things that really determines a successful revolution from a failed revolution is the issue of anger. Now, you can be angry in both types of revolution, the successful, the non-successful, the one turning to God, the one not, etc. But often the failed revolutions, all they have is anger. They don't have a noble vision. They don't have traditional literature framing their understanding. They're angry. They want to overthrow. They want to kill. They want violence in the streets. Those revolutions rarely ever do much good. The most successful revolutions are those that start as popular movements, but then eventually are led by a small group. I want to give one of the most important principles I'll give in this entire talk, and that is that history is not led by the majority. It's led by the dedicated minority. And so the revolutions that make the biggest difference and are the most successful are popular movements, but they don't just stay popular movements. Popular movements eventually peter out. What has to happen is a dedicated minority has to take the lead and move the revolution forward. That's what's happened in the American Revolution. You have what historians call a genius cluster, a brilliant gathering of men. And they're the ones who move the revolution forward. They're the ones who give it voice. They're the ones who craft the documents. They're the ones who inform the people. It's never a matter of the majority. In the American Revolution, only 1 in 16 people actually served in arms. Only 1 in 16.
Wow.
And the rest of them sat around and watched or joined the other side. So the issue is, if you just have a room full of people who are angry, or a nation of people who are angry, that's a start. But if that's all it ever becomes, if it's just anger, and obviously the French Revolution was a big spillover of anger and violence and bloodletting and sexual lust, if that's all you have, then it eventually peters out. But with the American Revolution, it was opposite, and that's why it succeeded.
Well, that's pretty alarming, because all I see on TV and news is angry people and angry politicians and intense polarization. Yeah. How does what you know about revolution gel with kind of where we're going as a nation in just such a polarizing manner? I know we're incredibly polarized back in the Civil War, worse so than now, at least in a physical sense, of course. But anyway, I love my country, and I wonder what telltale signs would signal that worse times are ahead.
Well, the things that would signal that worse times are ahead is that we had a complete crumbling of the order. Government couldn't deliver at all. You had a radicalizing of the people progressively. Great suffering was occurring. And that's one of the things that's probably our greatest promise, that we aren't heading towards a radical French-style revolution. If you and I were to lead a revolution today, we've talked enough that I know this, we would be leading a revolution to restore an order, to strengthen the work of the founding fathers, to not so much turn back the clock, but strengthen this country and its traditional foundations more so than to overthrow it and replace it with something leftist and Marxist and radical. Right. That was the strength after the Civil War that you refer to. While both sides disagreed on slavery and governance, the fact is, when the war was over, they all wanted to return to the order of the United States as it had been founded, minus slavery, of course. That's what's allowed us to be a country ever since 1865, when the war ended. But what you don't have there, you have some people who want to correct the order, but most people, and I've even sat down with members of Black Lives Matter, I've sat down with members of Muslim organizations in America, none of them want to completely destroy America. What they want is to modify aspects of it. And that speaks to how powerful the American idea is and how powerful the American nation is, that even what we call radicals just want to modify the country and fix some things, but not completely overthrow it.
So in the one sense, folks that would like to restore the way the country once was, you mentioned that things would have to get really bad. I'm picturing like a Great Depression level hyperinflation. You can really not feed your family, and you get angry enough that you're demanding. It's not that you don't like how the country's going, as if you don't take it back, your family might die, literally. And that's
Yes.
that return back to normal, in which you and I would, and a lot of people like us, to get back to the old way. That would have to be a little bit more present, closer reality to kind of put up your antenna. Am I hearing that right?
No, that's exactly right. Even during the American Great Depression, 10,000 people became millionaires. People were basically fed. You didn't have people dying on a massive scale because they were starving. I mean, they were poor, they were breadlines. But for the most part, people believed in the system and believed that a correction was necessary. And you had Franklin Roosevelt assuring them everything was going to be okay. So that's why you didn't have the complete overthrow of the American government during that time. And I think it would be the same today.
Right. And so that does give me a little bit of hope in that, okay, maybe that's not happening. But then I look at kind of the opposing side of the aisle. And instead of comparing it to that type of revolution, I think of something like the Chinese Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution. And it's kind of like, what if they're trying not to return to the old, which we know where our tipping point is, and it's farther off.
Sure.
For having the droves do it. What if it's some type of propagandized subversion to take us to a place we've never been before? What does that look like when you overlay those revolutions with current America?
Well, we're far from it in current America. It's because fundamentally people believe in the American system. They believe in freedom. And we've had enough revolutions of the kind that you described that didn't work. China today is not a thoroughly communist country. It's not a free market country, but it's an entrepreneurial, industrial, almost Western style country run by tyrants, no question about it. But it's not what Mao Zedong designed. The Soviet Union failed. It failed. And now it's true. It's a tyrant-run growing empire. Something we need to hold in check. But it's not what the revolution sought to produce. So in a sense, you can say that both the Chinese Revolution of 49, the Soviet Revolution of 1917, they failed. They didn't produce what they said they were going to produce because it doesn't work, because people didn't buy in, because they had too much suffering to buy into it. And I think that Americans, though they don't know a great deal of history, they know that history, and they realize those leftist revolutions don't work. They're not trying to tear down kill all the politicians and start some kind of new Soviet. There are some radical groups that, of course, would love to destroy America. But for the most part, the average person who's discontent in America simply wants America to work better, not for America to go away. And that's the greatest antidote to the kind of revolutions we've seen fail in history.
Got it. I had a side thought about just the pragmatism of totalitarian state like China, in that they have total control and they can keep that control, everyone underfoot. But instead, what you see is capitalistic machinations in that system. And it's not because it's, free market in the sense, it's that they know capitalism works, so they allow it to flourish, but it's all still owned by the state. At any moment, they can be like, all right, I want all your stuff. And then, but they allow capitalism and a bunch of other machinations to be able to be there. Anyway, it's just kind of like totalitarianism is proving to the world that capitalism works. And I just thought that's kind of funny. Is that fair?
No, that's absolutely fair. The fact is, both those revolutions failed. The leaders recognize it. So at best, what they did was a hybrid. We want you to look like America until we don't want you to anymore. So go produce cell phones, go produce tennis shoes, go produce, become the industrial center of the world, but we're going to control it from the top. So what they did was they kept the tyranny of the previous revolutions, but they unchained the economies. Yeah. This is the Singapore model. This is the Chinese model. This is et cetera. And so that's as far as we've gone. If you've been in China, I've been in China, you're looking at what feels like on the street a very much Western industrialized type of state, until, of course, you speak ill of the leader, and then you're going to get arrested. So the simplest way to say it is they've kept the tyranny of the previous revolutions, but they've unchained the economy Western style. And right now it's working for them.
Speaking of countries that look like America until they don't want it to look like America anymore, Australia looked very America-ish until, like, in the last year, it's an entirely different kind of country. It looked like we're pretty free until all of a sudden you're not free anymore. And what it looks like there, it looks like a lot of ticked off Australians. I was just hanging out with one of my buddies who is furloughing here in the U.S. and he's lived in Australia for years and years. And just all the reports that we get through the media, it's kind of like, nope, it's worse. It's really, really bad. And it looks like, to me, they look at a closer tipping point than we are, of course. What does Australia look like to you?
No, it looks that way very much. The difference between us and a country like Australia is here we have basically the Republican and Democratic Party. And except for the wing nuts in both parties, there's not that much distance. There's not that much different. And don't misunderstand. I'm a conservative, so I think the Democrats, many of them have lost their minds, and I'm not saying there's no difference at all. But for the most part, there's not much distance between them. When you have a parliamentary system like they have in Australia, well, they've got everything from a Marxist party in the parliament, to basically a strong right-wing party. And so what you have to do at that point is look at that as being the range of the country. In other words, there are actual Marxists in government. There are actual people who want a socialist state in government. And so at any given election, you can have that party come to power or exert influence. So I think that, Australia is basically England on a larger scale, and it's got more radicalism in it. It's got a tradition of extremism in it. And that extremism during times of crisis, this is one of the ways that leftists get control. It's called government by emergency. Whether the emergency happens naturally or it's concocted, it gives the leftist an opportunity to take over and to drive the country. And that's some of what's happened in Australia. It's a little bit of what's happened in New Zealand. And that's the trend there. And so that's one of the reasons we've got to be careful to hold our own.
Man, I hear all that. I am stuck on, one sentence you said there where Republican, Democrat aren't that far apart. I'm like, man, I feel incredibly far apart from, especially kind of that radical leftist ideology as well of like, and I feel like the divide has gotten farther and farther and farther away. At its base, it's kind of like the Democrats feels like government is the solution to all your problems, and conservative feels like government is the cause of a great many of your problems. I want small government. They want big government, of like, I want to be able to keep my stuff. They want to be able to confiscate and redistribute my stuff. And so it's like every kind of pillar from God and country and freedom and liberty, I feel a increasingly larger and larger and larger divide. And then I hear you say, no, we're actually not that far apart. Can you kind of help me with that?
Sure.
That seems incongruous with.
No, I understand what you're saying completely, and I understand the confusion. I'm a conservative, and therefore I looked at the left in America, the Democratic Party and the left. I am pro-life. I am not pro-abortion. I am, I don't want LGBTQ people to be shot on the streets, but I also don't want them driving the national agenda about marriage and what have you. There are lots of places of difference. The main thing I'm saying is, as much as we might disagree with those on the left in America, they're not as far to the left as people in other countries are on the left. Nobody in Congress is advocating seizing private property and controlling industries. Nobody's setting up gallows. You know what I mean? Nobody's arming up their own militias and planning to shoot you and me because they're on the left and we're on the right. It's not at that level yet. We're not yet, we could get there, but we're not yet at anything near pre-Civil War level. So what I'm saying is, it's not that there aren't grave differences between Republican and Democrat. It's that on the scope and in the range of world history and what some people are proposing, both on the hard right and the hard left. You and I are conservatives. We're not stomping the streets as neo-Nazis, goose-stepping and wearing swastikas and advocating for the killing of blacks and what have you. I mean, in a white nation, that's not the kind of conservatives we are. In other countries, that's happening. I used to live in Berlin, Germany. I had to get out of the way of a skinhead riot one time so I wouldn't be harmed. So all I'm saying is comparing it to the rest of the world and to the range of world history. Republican, Democrat, 30 points apart, but there's a 100-point range, and it could be much, much worse. We're just not there yet. So I'm not saying let's make buddies and all sit down and sing Kumbaya. I'm just saying we ain't anywhere near where a whole chunk of the world's nations are in terms of their range of government options.
No, and it's absolutely how a historian, I think, should see the world. And folks who say, this is as bad as it's ever been. It's never been this bad. I'm like, no, you just haven't read like anything. Or you've never traveled anywhere. Because as bad as stuff can feel, like, man, travel the world a bit or just read a little history and you'll be like, nah, things are bad. And it's not to minimize that. Things may get worse. But man, nobody is flaying me alive, peeling off my skin because of my religious beliefs. It could be way, way worse. Vikings could be overrunning my village, raping, pillaging, and plundering. Right?
Well, it's even been worse in American history.
Yeah.
I mean, after World War I, veterans were so upset that they set up camp on the mall in Washington, D.C. and stayed there for years. And there were riots and buildings set aflame and all kinds of things. And finally, Douglas MacArthur was ordered by the president to clear them out. And people were killed and people were burned to death. I mean, if that was happening today, we would think we were at the end of our republic. But it was a phase of history. It was tough. It was difficult. But we moved on and we came together as a nation again before World War II. So I can describe episode after episode after episode. We think they're fighting on Capitol Hill today. There was a man almost caned to death before the Civil War. Two men disagreed so much that one guy, back in the day when they all carried canes as a status symbol, beat his opponent almost to death on the Senate floor. My point is, It's been worse in this country than it is now. And that should provide a little bit of weird comfort for people that no, this is not the worst it's ever been, not even in America.
How do we bring canes back as a status symbol?
If you start making them, buddy, I'm buying them. That's all there is to it.
I was listening, Professor, honestly, but after you said cane as status symbol, I kind of blanked, and I was just imagining mine would definitely have a hidden sword in there, and it'd have some like dragony crystal handle, something like that.
You'd figure out some way to make it fire a projectile. I know you would.
Oh, that's a better idea than my secret sword idea. That's pure fire, man. That's awesome.
Let's do it.
Let's turn the temperature down on current events and stuff, and I want to return back to revolution stuff.
Okay.
When you think of all these different, Haitian Revolution, Communist Revolution, the Glorious Revolution, Bolshevik Revolution, how many of these revolutions moved the people from bad to better? How many of them, with the full benefit of hindsight, would have said, yeah, let's do this?
Hard to say. I'd say about half of them. The Haitian Revolution did not move the people into a better state for the most part. It moved them into a feeling of freedom with still tight control, and look where they are now. The Glorious Revolution was frankly pretty much a revolution amongst the elite. The average man didn't really experience that much of a change. Revolutions are often like that. That's why, again, I'm not just saying this because I'm an American, but the American Revolution is unique amongst world revolutions in that it actually changed everybody on the street. It transformed life from top to down by granting greater freedom at every level. There are things we call revolutions that are nothing but, agreements amongst the ruling class, and the average guy isn't living any different the next day than he was the day before. So I would say about half of these were successful. Few of them immediately make much difference in the life of the average person. Again, forgive me for going contemporary for a moment. You had a Chavez revolution in Venezuela, and it was just basically the elite and the parliament arguing and so on. And then finally, progressive policies grew and grew and grew. And now you got starvation on the streets. But it took years for that to happen. So often these revolutions are sort of handshakes amongst the elite, and they don't filter down to the people on the streets for quite a while, if they ever do. And some, again, like British revolutions, tend to often be just agreements among the elite that never affected the common man.
Gotcha. I love history because history speaks. It gives you her lessons all the time. It can, if you lean in closely, and not only can you gain personal fulfillment and enrichment, but it can really be this wonderful mentor and guide into a more prosperous future. So I'm a huge advocate of history. I love history, but wondering, as you just weigh all that you know about all these different revolutions, how are they speaking to us today? What are the great lessons that the totality of those revolutions have to let us know that, hey, this is what you need to know from these revolutions, and this is how it should help inform how you see the world and how you craft a new future with your fellow countrymen?
Here are the negatives to start with. Successful revolutions are not simply grasps for power, number one. Successful revolutions are not simply born of anger, and successful revolutions do not have as their goal violent ends. Some revolutions in the world have just been about, let's kill that other class, let's kill that other tribe. Those never work. Successful revolutions have a clearly defined worldview that they have in view, and they are led by people who are committed to, even experts in that worldview. Whether it's Christian or it's politically conservative or what have you, you have an understanding of the world. You have a vision of the way life ought to be, and you're contending for it. Mm-hmm. And normally, the thing that activates a revolution, once you have that vision in place, and you don't have the negatives that I just described, power, violence, etc., is that you have a dedicated minority. Mm-hmm. You have revolutions will not happen if it's all about the street rising up, the people on the street. Revolutions happen because there are the Thomas Jeffersons and the John Adams and the George Washingtons and et cetera, the Patrick Henrys, a dedicated minority who lead the people, lead the masses, and have their other hand grasping the ultimate vision. To say what I said at the beginning, which is, I think, one of the most important truths about revolutions: history is not ruled by the majority; it's ruled by the dedicated minority, and those are the ones who make revolutions possible. Had it not been for the genius cluster that led our country at the time of the Constitution Declaration, we would not be America right now. So we needed the broad vision, then we needed the dedicated minority, and then we needed the people who understood the broader vision and rose up to support it. But remember, even at the highest moment of the American Revolution, only a tiny sliver of the populace fought. But it was enough because they were right, and they were taking hold of God and tradition and trying to restore an order.
Fantastic. I'm going to have to go back and listen to that 5-minute blurb again and again. Never do I go back and watch my own videos. That was a powerful end. So I'm going to end it right there. Stephen Mansfield, thanks so much for coming in. Guys, if you're not acquainted with Stephen Mansfield, I got a bunch of his books. I'll even one day finish all of these. They're fantastic. You can find him at stephenmansfield.tv. And Mansfield Writes is the handle on all of his social media accounts. We'll have links down below for you. And Stephen, thanks so much for joining us. Would love to have you back sometime.
Anytime. I'm yours. Great to see you, my friend.
You as well. Hey, can I get you to start prepping for a President's Day video? I want to do a video on how should I think about presidents as the President's Day is coming up, and kind of
I'd love to do
some
it.
of that. All right, well then we'll plan on it, folks. He agreed right here, so you can hold him accountable. Guys, thanks for tuning in. Train hard, train smart, stay free, and read some good stuff. Lots of good books. So don't just buy them, read them. So cheers, guys. See ya.
Today we have Jorge Elizondo, super tough. He's one of those guys who live for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Yeah, with him we are gonna show some real scenarios. And we're gonna break down the technique here at the gym in the mat, right?
Your goal is to control the knife or the gun. After you have control of that, then you can do whatever you want with the gun.